I know we need to not overreact to week one. I get that. But every box that you need to win a national championship, every box that needs to be checked, quarterback, offensive line quality, defensive line quality, playmakers at wide receiver, team that's well coached by both coordinators. I think they have good systems, both offensively and defensively. I think they check every box. Hello and welcome in. It's always college football. I'm your host, Greg McElroy. We appreciate you guys being here with us. It's Labor Day, and as we always said when I was playing, we labor on Labor Day because it's a labor of love. This is one of my favorite shows of the week. I always love the Monday show. It allows us to dive a little deeper. If you missed our Sunday show, you can have some immediate rapid fire kind of streaming consciousness reaction to the outcomes on Saturday throughout the day. But it gives us time after the Sunday immediate takeaway show to dive in. Were we right with some of our immediate takeaways? Were we wrong? And then luckily enough for us, we had another big game last night that we will break down as well. So we'll tell you about USC. We'll tell you about LSU, where they go from here, and the other 8 or 9 things that we learned on Saturday throughout the day. I also want to encourage all of you to like, rate, and subscribe to the show wherever you get the show, whether it's on the ESPN YouTube channel. If you're here with us via the podcast, we appreciate you guys very, very much. Continue to tell your friends. Like you said, if you're looking for like hot takes, this is not your show. This is a show for the intellectual fan that really cares about the sport, and we're going to break down things. And yes, sometimes hot takes are necessary. But that's not really who we are. So if you hear it from us, you know we must really mean it. All right, so let's dive in with the 10 things that we learned from week 1 in college football. So we will call this upon further review. We have our immediate takeaways. Now we have our little in-depth takeaways, okay? But we will start, since it was last night, we'll start with the breakdown of USC and LSU. Takeaway number 1. Didn't USC just look a little different? Just observationally. Didn't they look different? I know that they've always been able to throw and catch and create seams and run and all this other stuff. That was all to be expected. But I was just really impressed by the poise and execution that we got from Miller Moss, first and foremost, to throw that perfect 28-yard touchdown to Jacoby Lane the way he did, just dropping it in the bucket, acknowledging that there was a guy offsides, you have a free play, immediate check, take the shot, touchdown. That was next level stuff. And I love Caleb Williams. Like, Caleb Williams was an outstanding football player, but oftentimes I felt like Caleb Williams, when I watched USC, he always seemingly wanted to take the ball into his own hands and just make the miraculous happen, as opposed to just staying on schedule, making pivotal decisions, getting the ball out quickly, identifying weaknesses in coverage and hitting those spots. Like, he always wanted to run around and create, and oftentimes I think he maybe tried to do too much. It's not a criticism. He was capable and became the first overall pick as a result. But I do think that Miller Moss is perfectly equipped to run Lincoln Riley's offense. The reason why Lincoln Riley got hired to become the OU offensive coordinator, the OU head coach, and now ultimately the USC head coach is because of his acumen offensively. And if you looked, he looked like there was an intensity within him that I hadn't seen in a while. There were times last year when you looked at him and he looked bleak, he looked deflated. I didn't see that last year. I felt like when Moss went onto the field and goes right down the field, 5 out of 6 on that last drive, on the 2nd and 15 shot that he threw to Kyron Hudson between 2 defenders, that was enormous. I just noticed a different sense of urgency offensively from USC. But what might have been the biggest difference was a group that gave up nearly 35 points a game last year, a group that held LSU, a group, by the way, LSU is a good offensive team. That's a good quarterback. Those are good weapons. There's a lot to feel good about when you hold a group like that to 20 points offensively. Awesome start to the Anton Lynn era for the Trojans. The other thing I'll say about that too, How often last year, when it was a critical short yardage situation for USC's defense, that you almost felt like a short yardage conversion was an inevitability? Felt like, hey, when I was in 3rd and 1, and let's say I was playing for, say, Cal. Cal has 3rd and 1. Yep, Jaden Knott's getting it. He's getting the first down. Well, last night, how many different times in short yardage situation was USC's defense up to the task? They looked more physical. They tackled better in open space. I thought, were more disruptive. They were still very quick along the defensive line, but there were things that I saw last night that were so encouraging on that side of the ball. So really impressed. They bring in the 6 transfers. I thought all 6 transfers that we saw on defense had moments last night. It was just an excellent start to the season for SC. I'm not sure you could have asked for a better recipe for them going and getting arguably the biggest win of the Lincoln Riley era. Takeaway number 2. LSU has to be kicking themselves with their game plan offensively. We know that when you look at what Garrett Nussmeier is, he's really good thrower. I think he showcased that talent last night. He was pinpoint accuracy on a bunch of different occasions, making difficult throws look easy. The weapons on the perimeter were really good. We know that this is a very athletic group that's high flying. Mason Taylor had some great moments. LSU's passing attack is outstanding and will continue to be. I think they're probably only going to get better from this point forward. But the strength of this offense coming into the season, according to many, was their offensive line. You have bookended first-round tackles. You have guys on the interior that have played a ton of football. Like, they have a size talent advantage over most of the teams that they're going to play against. And to watch that group run for only 117 yards against USC, that's the fewest yards allowed by USC on defense since September 23rd of last year. That's got to be pretty encouraging to see that type of growth, to see that type of I guess, havoc caused by USC's defensive line. It was awesome. But why did it take LSU so long to try to impose their will running the football? Like, John Emery, I thought, had some really good moments. LSU needs to look in the mirror and say, hey, the strength of our team, well, I love our quarterback, well, I love our wide receivers, the strength of our team is our offensive line, and we need to lean into that much earlier in the game plan. I didn't think they did a very good job of that. And that, I think, was very disappointing. Now, some people will also look and start citing, well, Brian Kelly doesn't know how to get teams prepared to play in the opener. All right, so they're 0-3 in his 3 games to start the season at LSU. Understandable. And you can point to mistakes made in the first game against Florida State, whether it was dropped punts and stuff like that. So, like, that was just a terrible game. Terrible performance, tons of mistakes, but very correctable mistakes. Year 2, they weren't as good as Florida State. They lost to a better team, and they lost convincingly. Year 3, I looked at this, and I felt like, while SC deserves immense amount of credit, LSU has some soul searching to do after the performance, because they should have led with the run and complemented with the pass, and I don't feel like they did that adequately enough. Instead, they led with the pass and complemented with the run, and that might not be the recipe for them to have success moving forward when they get into conference play. Let's move to takeaway number 3. And coming from me, this one probably doesn't surprise you very much. Miami is more than a playoff contender. Now, you're going to sit there and say, well, Cam Ward, the adjustments, they beat a bad Florida team. I'm fine with all of that. Good with all of those things. Whether you believe in Florida or don't believe in Florida, that's totally up to you. All I'm saying is that when I went back and watched the Miami game, I believe that is a team that can not just get to the playoffs. They can get to the playoffs. We know that by winning the ACC. But I think that's a team that can potentially, just saying, win the whole thing. I really believe that they have that type of ceiling. They're that talented at wide receiver. They're that talented at quarterback. They have experience along the offensive line. They're extremely disruptive along the defensive line. And then the position group that I was most concerned about on their entire roster was the secondary. And I look at the secondary having to replace 4 starters from a year ago. A couple of those starters were real difference makers. And they entered the game with, I thought, 2 pretty difficult weapons to try to defend for Florida, whether it's Eugene Wilson and Badger. Like, I think those 2 guys are pretty dang good. And I was super impressed with what I saw from the back end from the Miami Hurricanes. So when the position of concern for you is addressed week 1 with impressive play, I'm telling you, man, I think the sky's the limit for this team. I really believe this. I know they're going to be able to rush the passer. I know they were really stout for the most part. People will look at the rushing stats, and they're a little bit skewed by the 71-yard touchdown. But if you look at Montrell Johnson, you remove the 71-yard touchdown, which was just well-blocked, 1. And 2, I didn't think it was a great job in the fit, but I digress. You remove that, I mean, they had actually done a decent job up front defensively, I thought. So all those things considered, I think they have everything that you could possibly want to win a national championship this year. But the thing that I'm most encouraged by was Cam Ward, his ability to extend plays. The guy faced pressure. Now, didn't face it often. And I know that we're all still kind of wondering at the moment, will Florida be good on defense? I'm not sure I know the answer to that based on this performance. I do know this, though, that when Cam Ward faced pressure, it did not faze him. I also know this, when I watched Miami last year, it felt like mistakes, especially at quarterback, were compounded. So if Tyler Van Dyke made a mistake in the first quarter, he spent 3 quarters trying to make up for that mistake. Well, we saw it early. Bad interception by Cam Ward. I think he was trying to force it, scrambling to his left, trying to do too much, to be expected. That was a bad decision. All right. Really, really bad decision. Well, after that, they got the ball back 7-3. They went on. The next thing you know, they're up 38-10, and it's a completely different ball game. Like, the mistake did not define Cam Ward's play that day. He allowed it to roll off his back like any veteran would, and he became a better player after the mistake without trying to force and do too much by trying to overcompensate for the mistake made earlier in the game. So I look at Miami. I think they're a legitimate national championship contender after a week 1 performance. I know we need to not overreact to week 1. I get that. But every box that you need to win a national championship, every box that needs to be checked, quarterback, offensive line quality, defensive line quality, playmakers at wide receiver, team that's well coached by both coordinators. I think they have good systems, both offensively and defensively. I think they check every box. I really believe that, and they're super physical as well, which is only going to help them even more. Takeaway number 4. Notre Dame's physicality was a 10+. You go back and watch that game, that was a thorough physical 2 chin strap game, multiple mouthpiece game. Like, that was a slugfest. Now, all that being said, there were a couple times in the run game where I felt like Texas A&M kind of took themselves out of position with some movement. But I also thought with how Jadarian Price and Jeremiah Love ran in the second half, with how those guys really got going, they became extremely difficult to tackle. And on a night when offenses were somewhat stagnant for a vast majority of the game, to have an offensive line that entered the night with just 6 career starts, to play like that against a front like that was super encouraging. So I think the run game, and you couple that with how Riley Leonard can factor into the run game as well. I mean, there was moments in the game where you felt like he really was the best threat to run the football, at least earlier in the game before Price and Love ultimately got going. But you look at this group, and I think we're going to have to just understand at some point, Riley Leonard's arm is going to have to win Notre Dame games. It might not happen in the regular season. Maybe it doesn't happen until the playoffs. But if you're Marcus Freeman, your ultimate goal is to not just get to the playoff, but make noise in the playoff. I think that this is a passing attack that needs to improve. And I wouldn't be super concerned. I wouldn't be if this hadn't kind of been who Riley Leonard was at his previous destination. If you look at his numbers pushing the ball down the field at Duke, they left something to be desired. If you look at how things went in this game against A&M, there weren't really a whole lot of opportunities to open things up in the passing game. And I'm just wondering, and people will look at the numbers, 18 to 30, 158, what have you. People will look at the numbers, and there were moments where I just didn't feel like there was ever a time in which A&M's secondary was truly threatened. And I think these weapons are good enough to have a really balanced attack. They can run it, feel good about that. I think there needs to be growth made in the passing attack. And maybe Mike Denbrock sits there and says, the offensive coordinator, and says, hey, in this game, we knew our defense was totally in control. We knew running game, only bad things can happen when you throw it. We're not going to really try to take a lot of unnecessary risk. We're going to play it super close to the vest and hopefully just survive in advance. Maybe that was his approach, but that won't work when you have to play against Ohio State. That won't work when you have to play against Georgia, against teams that you might see in the college football playoff, assuming you get there. So I think the passing attack for Notre Dame is very much a work in progress, but I'm super optimistic with what I saw from a physical standpoint and from a run game standpoint, especially from a group along the O-line that is that inexperienced. Takeaway number 5. Clemson has a path to the playoff, but it's really narrow. Okay. Now, we're going to react strongly to Clemson's performance against Georgia, and we should. It was not a vintage Clemson performance by any stretch. It's a group that had 188 yards of offense. Okay. Last year, Clemson was a team that struggled to push the ball down the field. Those struggles continued in week 1. Last year, this was a group that really leaned down the stretch on running the football with great efficiency. And you had heard that the offensive line, under new offensive line coach Matt Luke, they're more physical. They're going to be able to mow people off the ball more so than they did in the past. That didn't materialize against Georgia. Now, how much of that had to do with Georgia? How much of that had to do with Clemson? I don't know the answer to that. I don't. I think a lot of it had to do with Georgia, but I do think some of it had to do with Clemson. Maybe they're not who we thought they were. The other thing that I think is going to be very, very important is to acknowledge. Now, while everybody, and I've seen the headlines, Dabo can't get it done. Dabo's refusal to acknowledge the transfer portal is going to be his undoing. His willingness to change and adapt to the landscape is going to be his downfall. I've read all the different stories. I've read all the reactions, not saying they're unfair, not saying they're untrue, just saying that all they need to do at Clemson to get to the playoff is win the ACC. And if you look at the ACC, remove Miami from the equation, who in the ACC, based off of week 1 performance, scares you to death? That's all I'm saying. Scares you to death. Because I'll tell you this, Miami does. Miami's the real deal. Case closed. Really believe that. But Florida State, NC State, Virginia Tech, I think all 3 of those teams, 3 teams that could be factors at the top of the ACC, none looked overwhelmingly impressive in week 1. So all that being said, Clemson is very much alive to make a run this year. Now, here's the problem. Can they win a national championship right now? I don't know if I'd go that far. I personally don't think they can beat teams like Georgia, Ohio State, and Penn State in 3 consecutive weeks. I don't think I would choose them to win against any of those 3 teams. But I do know the way they play defense. They're going to be really good along the defensive line. Saw that. They ran out of gas in the second half of last week's game, but they're going to be really good along the defensive line. I love their linebackers. I think their secondary did a great job in coverage for the first 3 quarters of the game. But their offense has to give them something. And I look at this offense, and when Garrett Riley was hired from TCU, he was long praised about how they pushed the ball down the field, how Max Duggan, they used quarterback run game. They hit big plays downfield. Where are the big plays? Like, these wide receivers are plenty good to make big plays down the field. They're plenty good. There were multiple times on Saturday in which Clemson wide receivers were behind the defense, and Cade Klubnik's inaccuracy led to incompletions. Like, they have to be able to push the ball down the field. They have to be more aggressive when it comes to throwing the ball, because if you look at the air yards per attempt last year, Cade Klubnik was in the 120s. They have to take those chances. They have to take those risks. And while I don't know if their receivers are as good as they once were, they're plenty good enough to manufacture big plays, especially when you have a back like Phil Maffa that's going to be very difficult to bring down for most of the teams they're going to face this year. So Clemson still has a path to the playoff, but it is narrow. Takeaway number 6. We have already speculated a million different ways how the Big Ten this year is going to unfold. I, like most, feel real confident about Ohio State. Still do. Know it was a bit of a slow start, but come on. Like, Ohio State's going to be fine. I'm not going to use their game against Akron as an indicator of future results. They're going to be fine. I'm not even, frankly, going to use the Oregon performance against Idaho as an indicator. Like, I think they need to be maybe a little more efficient in the red zone. Like, all right, fine. They had 500 yards of offense, and they got beat by a couple of wild plays. Anyways, I still think, though, upon further review, there is a case to be made that Penn State is the biggest threat to Ohio State in the Big Ten. Now, a case to be made. I'm not going to necessarily stamp it with a 100% guarantee, hey, the Big Ten title is going to be between Penn State and Ohio State. I'm not going that far just yet. I'm not. But there were a few things on Saturday that made me feel really, really encouraged by what I saw from Penn State. We'll start by the offensive creativity of Andy Kotelnicki. Now, I don't think Andy Kotelnicki rolled out his best stuff against West Virginia, but I found it pretty interesting that he had both quarterbacks on the field at the same time from time to time. I thought it was pretty interesting that he had 2 running backs on the field, both Allen and Singleton, lined up in the backfield. Thought it was pretty interesting that they were in 12 personnel and they were getting in and out of different personnels. I thought it was also interesting that you had a guy that weighs 350 pounds that was in motion on run plays. That's right. Having an extra offensive lineman that was used in motion. Those are things I never saw from the Penn State offense of the last few years. And that's not a criticism of Yursich, their former offensive coordinator. It's just an acknowledgement that Andy Kotelnicki will do whatever it takes. And if it's weird, perfect, put it in to make sure that his offense has an advantage on every snap. I think they're going to use weird formations. I think they're going to use strange motions. I think they're going to have unusual, from time to time, unusual personnel groupings. I think they're going to have all that stuff. And that is going to give them an advantage with their personnel over a lot of people. The other thing I would say, Drew Aller looked better, didn't he? In 13 starts last year, 13 starts, Drew Aller had 5 completions of 50-plus yards. Well, he had 2 in the first half in week 1 against West Virginia. That's pretty encouraging. Granted, all right, you look at the numbers, 11 of 17, 216 yards, 3 touchdowns. All those numbers are excellent. But it appeared more when you dive just a touch deeper. He just looked more poised. Like, he looked more comfortable. He seemed to stay calm a little. He also showcased some athletic ability too. Like, we know he's got that, but it hasn't always been a huge part of his repertoire. So to see him add nearly 50 yards on the ground just with his legs, including, a couple of decent sized runs, a couple of 10-yard, 15-yard, like, there was kind of nice to see. And the other thing I like too, I feel like Penn State has been conservative offensively at times since Trace McSorley and Saquon Barkley graduated. That was not the case on Saturday. Let's just use an example. 32 seconds left in the first half. Penn State's up 13-6. A lot of coaches are sitting there thinking to themselves, yeah, that's only bad things can happen at that point. Okay. Taking over at the 35-yard line, maybe you pop one and then you go into 2-minute mode and say, hey, maybe we can steal some points before the half. Well, they had one timeout remaining. Feels like last year they would have just run it out and take it to half, up 7. We're in a good spot. Well, you got Amari Evans, completion, boom, 18-yard pass next to Wallace. I haven't seen the gas pedal pressed like that from Ohio or from Penn State in a while. So super encouraging. And that just goes to show you, like, this staff must feel real confident in what they have at quarterback, at wide receiver, and their personnel across the board offensively. So that is super encouraging. So maybe just maybe, Penn State might be the biggest threat based on week 1 performance to Ohio State in the Big Ten. Takeaway number 7. Is it just me? And I'd love y'all's kind of feedback on this because, and look, the world's changed drastically. But is it just me, or are freshmen just better than they used to be? You know what I mean? Like, I think back, like when I got to school, this was in 2006. So it might as well have been, 50 years ago. But we all arrived on campus on June 5th, and we went through summer workouts, and then you went to camp and you were good to go. We might have had 2 or 3 guys that showed up and had a mid-year enrollee. Now there's 2 or 3 guys that are showing up in the summer. The other 22 guys that you sign are all there throughout spring and throughout winter workouts and things like that. So players are more prepared now than ever because of the reps they get in spring to factor into the rotation in year number 1. But we're kind of going even a step further. Like, I remember the best freshman I ever saw with my own 2 eyes was Adrian Peterson. And I remember vividly watching Adrian Peterson as an 18-year-old freshman for Oklahoma completely take the college football world by storm. I think he ran for nearly 2,000 yards, was a unanimous All-American his true freshman year. You know how hard it was to do that back then? Like, that just didn't happen, okay? He was also the first ever freshman finalist for the Doak Walker Award. He was ridiculous, okay? But now it's almost like every team, or 20 to 25 teams, have a big-time difference-making freshman that's on the field week 1 to help their team. Jeremiah Smith at Ohio State, 6 catches, 92 yards, all in the first half. The first freshman with multiple receiving touchdowns in their debut since Michael Wiley in 1996. That's pretty impressive. Nate Frazier, running back from Georgia, 5'10", 210. Weren't even sure how much of a factor he was going to play. Well, Trevor Etienne is not available. Who are we going to go with? We'll go with the freshman Frazier. He responds, 11 carries, 83 yards. Also contributed in the passing game, had a 24-yard reception. Did have a couple drops, 2 by my count. But still, to be that effective in your college debut is incredible. Anthony Knapp for Notre Dame. Offensive line, huge question mark. Weren't really sure what you're going to get. Going crazy young. Let's just figure it out. We'll just hopefully be great in time. Maybe we have some growing pains, but look, you had a couple penalties. It wasn't flawless, but to hang in there against that group, pretty dang impressive. How about Dylan Stewart for South Carolina? Former 5-star, had the strip sack there when they were inside the 10, which set up the game-winning touchdown. And granted, South Carolina had their hands full with ODU, and they might not have won the game if not for the strip sack that Dylan Stewart had. Okay, that was amazing. Alabama wide receiver Ryan Williams, 2 receptions. He's 17 years old, 2 receptions, 84 yards, 55 yards. The first one kind of like a blown coverage, just wide open right down the right side. And then the second one, nice catch and run, like breaking some tackles, showing some strength for a guy 17 that only weighs 175 pounds. Pretty wild to anticipate that. And then finally, the much anticipated debut of Dylan Raiola. And I know it's UTEP. I get that. And we just talked about this a moment ago when talking about Penn State right before half, trying to figure out, all right, do we go and try to steal some points? Do we not? We got a freshman quarterback out there. Like, do we really want to put him in a situation? You evaluate quarterbacks' readiness based on 2-minute execution. I've always felt like that's one of the best indicators. 3rd down QBR and 2-minute execution. What made Tom Brady the greatest player to ever play the quarterback position? How he executed 2-minute. The guy was absolute surgeon. Well, 72 seconds left in the first half. You got Nebraska who's facing 3rd and 12 at their own 39-yard line. Yeah, they're in a good spot at this point. But Dylan Raiola had just gotten off the field. He had just been knocked off after taking a sack, lost his helmet, came back out 3rd and 12, and boom, found it right in a tight window to Isaiah Nayor, right over the middle for a gain of 15. And they didn't even use a timeout. They get up, they get it to Jamal Banks. Like, it was just really, really impressive to see the poise and the demeanor and the comfort level within the scheme in a 2-minute situation. That's rare. So I'm telling you, takeaway number 7, freshmen are just more prepared to come onto the field and be difference makers early in their career. Now, we're going to talk a lot about Dylan Raiola and this offense later in the week because they play Colorado, and that'll be one of our featured games of the week when we do our Thursday breakdowns. But very impressed with the start from him among many other freshmen. I'm sure there's 5 or 6 that I didn't even account for. But just know freshmen can now come right in and in some cases be the best player on the field. Let's go next to number 8. SEC offenses, several of which are already in midseason form. Now, I'm not going to take a ton away from performances against FCS teams, but when you have 16 schools that average nearly 46 points a game in week 1, that's pretty impressive. That's the highest scoring weekend in SEC history. You heard that right. That is the highest scoring weekend in SEC history. The next closest was 43.6 points per game back in 2018. The SEC had 4 wins on Saturday by more than 60 points. That's the most of any conference in a single day in the AP poll era. That dates all the way back to 1936. Arkansas won 70-0 on Thursday. The SEC has matched the most 60-point wins by a conference in a season in 1 week. The ACC had 5 60-point wins across the entire 2013 season. Well, the SEC has already done that in week 1. 3 SEC schools scored at least 70 points. The first 91 years of the conference, only 8 teams had scored 70 points in a season opener, and 3 of them did it in week 1. Crazy. Like I said, I'm just reading out like stats. This is just like mind-blowing to think about some of these stats, regardless of who the opponent is. It's just crazy to think about. Ole Miss beat Furman 76-0. First SEC school to score 70-plus in back-to-back season openers. Alabama didn't quite get to 70, but they cruised to a 63-0 victory over a perennial bowl team in Western Kentucky. Jalen Milroe had a terrific day. Looked very comfortable in the new offense. Tennessee scored nearly 70 as Nico Iamaleava looked very much in control. 3 touchdowns, 314 yards, a lot of like from that performance. Texas pitched a shutout 52-0 against Colorado State, even though it was kind of interesting to see how Texas approached it. I think they got a lot of juice, a lot of weapons on the perimeter, but I will be curious to see when they face off against Michigan this week, and we'll talk, obviously, a lot about that game. Will they be able to take the fight to them because they lived a little more on the perimeter than I anticipated? Will they maybe be a bit more aggressive in trying to go downhill against Michigan? We will find out. But the SEC offenses feel like they're rolling, even though the level of competition was painfully bad in most cases. To have that type of efficiency and execution on offense was really impressive. Let's go to number 9. Georgia is the best team in the country after week 1. Now, let's just go. And when we talk about Georgia and teams of the past from Bama and teams of the past, frankly, from Clemson and Ohio State and Michigan, you're always going to compare the present day version to the best version of that program. So like when we compare Georgia in 2024, you're probably going to compare them to the national championship winning teams of 21 and 22. And I think you can compare them somewhat to the team that we saw on the field last year. But let's just, for all intents and purposes, average out the last 3 years and just compare this Georgia team to those 3. Well, let's start at quarterback. I think they're better at quarterback now than they've ever been. including last year when Carson Beck was playing great football, including when Stetson Bennett was there. I think Carson Beck is the best Georgia quarterback since Matt Stafford. And I even think that while he might not be quite as physically gifted in his right arm as Matt Stafford, his accuracy, his decision-making, the way he gets the ball out on time, really impressive. I didn't even think he had his best stuff on Saturday, and yet he cruised all throughout the game against Clemson. At running back, now terrific ATN whenever he returns from suspension. It'll be interesting to see what's going on there. But you can't sit there and say, well, running back's a position of concern. Last year, running back, huge issue for the Georgia Bulldogs. I mean, at one point, they had to take a wide receiver and move him to running back because of injuries and guys that were in and out of the lineup. Running back this year is in much better hands than it was a year ago at Georgia. Offensive line, I think they're about the same, which is pretty dang good. Offensive line has been good for Georgia. I expect it to be good again. Weapons. Now, there is no Brock Bowers on this team. You don't have that nightmare matchup on this roster. You also, I don't know if you have that super dependable, great route runner, tremendous on third down weapon that was Ladd McConkey. Like, you don't have those two guys. But you might overall be more athletic amongst your weapons, which is a crazy thing to think about. But you look at Dominic Lovett, unbelievable run after catch, super athletic. Arian Smith might be one of the fastest guys in the country at his position. You look at what you get from Dylan Bell and his position versatility and run after catch. Like I said a second ago, he played running back last year, but he's a wide receiver. And when you get him the ball, you can't bring him down. Corners can't tackle him. He is a handful with the ball in his hands. You have the size that you're getting from Colby Young, who caught a back shoulder fade. He's 6'3", 215, and makes a ton of contested catches. London Humphreys, who didn't play a whole lot, but had two significant catches, one on third down over the middle, one on a touchdown out the back door late in the game. He's got unbelievable speed as well. You have, I think, 3 tight ends that are all solid. None are Bowers, but are all rock solid. And then defensively, this is a crazy stat. But when you think USC's defense, what do you think? Say that again. When you think USC's defense from 2023, what do you think? You think not very good, right? Not great. Well, what if I were to tell you that USC and Georgia had the same amount of sacks last year? That's right. Both teams had 30 sacks. USC and Georgia. You wouldn't have thought that, right? That was tied for 47th in the country. What if I were to tell you that Georgia, since Kirby Smart has gotten there, has forced 150 turnovers, and that is 52nd in the sport? It's kind of crazy to think about, right? Because when you think Georgia, you think, man, that's one of the best defenses in America. Well, they're middle of the pack in the country when it comes to turning people over. That's wild. So all that being said, I think this defense has a chance to be more disruptive in the front seven than they've had the last couple of years. Because I look at what the 21 and the 22 version was. They were big, they were physical, you couldn't move them, and you couldn't run it on them. I mean, they had Jordan Davis, for crying out loud. Like, you're not going to move Jordan Davis off the ball. He's 360 pounds. But this group, athletically in the front seven, might be more athletic than the last few versions of Georgia on defense. So that's worth monitoring. The one question that I have, and it still remains, I think Georgia does have question marks in the secondary. I think Malachi Starks is amazing. I think he's ridiculous. That interception he made the other day against the deep ball was just absolutely next level ridiculous. But I do think at corner, there are some question marks for me still amongst the Georgia Bulldogs. And I think they got to get Janelle Aguero healthy at nickel for them to go to the top. But KJ Bolden, really impressive freshman. He'll have a bright future. I still think the question marks, if you're going to beat Georgia, you got to take advantage of their secondary. We'll find out as the season goes along and they start to play against better passing attacks, just how improved that group may be, or are they the same as they were in week 1 against Clemson? But takeaway number 9, Georgia, as of this moment, appears to be like best team in the sport. And takeaway number 10. I hope you guys understand where I'm coming from here, okay? Because I think this can be misconstrued and people will have a strong reaction to this without really thinking about it. But we don't need to see FCS against Power 5 programs anymore. Like, I understand Colorado had a great game against against North Dakota State. Like, that was a really competitive game. I understand that there were examples this past weekend in which an FCS team gave a Power 5 team a little bit of trouble. Western Carolina against NC State, Abilene Christian against Texas Tech. Like, there are examples of that. But y'all, when you watch a vast majority of these games, I'm talking a vast majority of these games, the gap in talent between what you're seeing from the Power 5 program and what you're seeing from the FCS program, or even the low-level G5 program, is astronomical. It's bigger than it's ever been. It's just flat out like taking a varsity team in high school football and playing them against a ninth grade football team. Both high school teams, but one is a super physically mature team. The other is undersized and probably in some cases younger because they aren't able to go out and get the portal guys. So I'm really concerned about having these games in the future. Like, I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's good watch. I don't think it's, and people say, well, they need the money. I get that. Totally get that. Let's do something and write something in the 2026 version of the CFP where we carve off a little bit of money to provide the FCS so that they continue to play football because they need that revenue. But we don't need to see those games on the field. They're not competitive. I watched a game the other day. I'm not kidding. It was Arkansas against Arkansas Pine Bluff. I swear the Arkansas Pine Bluff left tackle had to have been 245 pounds. And that's dangerous going against 310-pound defensive ends. So I think the gap now, because of NIL, because of transfer portal, all the best players from the FCS are getting recruited by G5 programs. We've seen a million of them. In some cases, all the best players of the FCS are getting recruited by Power 5 programs. Look at Jared Verse a couple years ago from Albany, gets recruited to Florida State, becomes a first-round pick. Back in the day, there used to be a time where FCS players had elite players that couldn't transfer and nobody knew about. Now, the second they put good tape out there, they're getting recruited or poached by a big school because of NIL and because of the portal. So the gap that exists right now between FCS and the Power 5 has never been bigger. And then lastly, I think it's going to be really interesting how the G5 programs fare in the college football playoff this year, because based on what I've seen through week one, that game between the G5 and the Power 5 team in the 5-12 matchup, based on what I've seen through week one, that game will not likely be competitive. You get a Georgia team against Boise, I don't anticipate that game being competitive. Even though Boise looked great, Ashton Gentie's amazing, the gap is just too significant now. It's more significant than it's ever been. And based on all the games I watched this past weekend, that gap is the size of a Grand Canyon. Before we put a bow on things today, I want to quickly address just Colorado's performance having gone back and upon further review. That's what we do here on Mondays. Upon further review, watching Travis Hunter play 129 out of 131 snaps, just thinking to do that on any surface, let alone at altitude in Boulder, Colorado, where fatigue is more likely because of the oxygen levels in the air, is absolutely insane. And while I go back and forth all the time, like I see all the numbers and all the finances that these receivers are getting. Like, I think Travis Hunter's best bet in the NFL is at wide receiver. I know corner has always been a super premium position, but receiver in the last few years has become increasingly more important than it's ever been in the history of the sport. I think Travis Hunter's a wide receiver in the league because his ball skills are absolutely off the charts. But to just how great of a football player is ridiculous. And just all the different things that he can do, the speed and how quickly he gets to full speed and his body control when the ball's in the air is just off the charts good. And if you don't, you don't have to buy into the Colorado hype or anything like that. I'm not giving him the Heisman Trophy or anything like that. As you know, on our show, we do not say the word Heisman as it relates to one specific player until mid or late November. But if he can continue to do what he's doing on both sides of the ball in some big games against quality competition, like starting this week against a Nebraska team that most people think is really good on defense, it's going to be hard not to acknowledge his presence as not just one of the best in this year's version of college football, but one of the best of all time because of his versatility on both sides of the ball. So wanted to leave you with that. Just was blown away with his performance from last week and just continued to be amazed at what a great football player he is. That'll do it for us here at Always College Football. Continue to ask all of you guys, as always, to like, rate, and subscribe to the show wherever you get your show. You can also follow the show on our social media at Always CFB on both Instagram and on Twitter. You can follow me on social media at Greg McElroy as well. So for all of us here at Always College Football, check back with us again on Wednesday. We'll have a show for you. And then, of course, Thursday preview shows. That's our favorite show of the week. So lock in right here on Always College Football. For all of us here at Always College Football, for Mark, Jake, Jack, the other Jack, I'm Greg. We hope you have an amazing day. And remember, it's always college football. Hey guys, it's Greg McElroy. Thanks for watching Always College Football. Make sure you like, rate, and subscribe to ESPN's YouTube channel and wherever you listen to your podcasts.